For more about what the extreme heat means for some vulnerable groups in this country, we're joined now by Blair Feltmate. He's the head of the Intact Centre for Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. This morning, he's in Oakville, Ontario. So Blair, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So earlier this morning, we spoke with a doctor looking for tips and advice here about how to keep people who were both younger, so infants, for example, and then people who were older safe during these extreme heat events. But for a moment here, let's focus on people who are experiencing homelessness. How vulnerable are they?
They're particularly vulnerable. There are really three groups in the country that are vulnerable to extreme heat. The elderly, living alone, people greater than 70 years of age of limited financial means. That's the number one group at risk. Number two is the homeless, people living on the streets. And then the third group are people with pre-existing health conditions that are generally cardiac and respiratory in nature. But for the second group, the homeless, we literally need teams within cities, roving teams, to check on the homeless during extreme heat events and make sure, are they properly hydrated? Do they know where the cooling centers are? Do they need a ride to a cooling center? Things like this, so we can alleviate the risks they're incurring a little bit.
And certainly we know when we're talking about people experiencing homelessness, oftentimes it's in big urban centers, in big cities. So talk to us here about what's called the urban heat island. What is it? How does it complicate things?
Yeah, cities tend to be, due to something called the urban heat island effect, about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius minimally warmer than the surrounding countryside, where you have trees and tree canopy and a lot of shade. Cities tend to be very dark surfaced areas. For example, anybody who's flown into Toronto or Calgary or other large cities, if you look down at the window of the plane, you'll see that the roofs of the buildings are almost universally black, or they're dark surfaced, and it's tar. And when sunlight hits that dark surface, only about 20% of that energy radiates back up into space, and the rest of the energy stays in the system in the form of heat. So these dark surfaced areas, i.e. cities, as a result of this phenomena and the dark surface of roads and other surfaces, they tend to be about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding landscape. So literally, for example, what we could do to alleviate that risk a little bit is to paint the surfaces of the rooftops of buildings, factories, apartment buildings, etc., white. When you paint them white and the sunlight hits that surface, about 80% of the energy reflects back into space and only about 20% stays in the system. And that contributes to relative coolness as to where you'd be if you only had dark surfaces.
I was reading just earlier this week, actually, that people in India are being encouraged to do just that right now, to paint the tops of their homes with this heat-reflecting white paint. Now, Blair, earlier this morning, I was reading some of your research. Some of it is pretty startling. So just to bring our viewers some of these numbers, according to your research, if you take Toronto as an example, right now, on average, there are somewhere between 12 and 14 days a year where it is 30 degrees Celsius or hotter. By your estimates here, by 2050 to 2060, there could be 55 days on average where it is 30 degrees or higher. Talk to us about what that is going to mean, both for people who are more vulnerable, but then for Canadians in general as well, if we are going to see more and more of these heat events.
Yeah. So, and by the way, this is a phenomenon for cities right across Canada, not just Toronto. Just as a general rule of thumb, to expand a little bit on the numbers you just quoted, between now and 2050 to 2060 range, the maximum daily temperature in cities, the hottest temperature to which cities reach currently, that's going to increase by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius over the next 30 to 40 years. So, for example, in Toronto right now, if we tapped out at more or less, say, 35 degrees Celsius, that's going to go up towards 39, 40 degrees Celsius. And as you correctly identified, the number of hot days per summer over 30 degrees Celsius for the Toronto region is going to more or less triple. And the increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in maximum daily temperature and hot days over the number of hot days over 30 degrees Celsius over the next 30 years. As a general rule of thumb, that applies to all major cities across Canada, that are going to see a tripling in the number of hot days and 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer. So in other words, all of that boils down to things are going to get a lot hotter. And what we need to do is think about this extreme heat, or preparedness for extreme heat, as a fundamental human right in terms of access to coolness. We need to think of access to coolness as a fundamental human right, the same way we think of access to warmth in the winter as a fundamental human right. And if we don't do that, we're going to see people die, quite literally, in high numbers due to exposure to extreme heat.
Blair, I don't have a lot of time left here, but just quickly on that point, picking up on that point, besides from the example you gave of maybe painting the tops of buildings and factories white, is there anything else that the average person, the average Canadian can do to try and prepare for that?
Sure. Even in and around their homes, we can have awnings on windows to block sunlight coming directly into apartments or condos or a house that somebody's living in. We can have glazing on windows that is designed in such a way to keep the heat on the outside, not the heat transfer to the inside of the house. We can have vents in the tops of buildings to allow heat to escape up out of buildings to allow for more passive cooling. We certainly want to have more shade capacity, more trees within cities to give people an area to go and sit under the shade of trees versus not having these trees. So there's a multiplicity of things we can do to bring coolness to the city and give people a degree of relief.
Blair, great to speak with you this morning. Thank you for this.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Blair Feltmate for us in Oakville.